Gosh, I can't wait till the barbershops open up again. Alright, so one of the questions I get asked the most is how I became a novel and script editor, how I got this to be my day job. Naturally, I think a bunch of people are interested themselves in doing this kind of work, and want my expertise as a type of guide on what they should be doing. So I'm more than happy to describe for you all the path that I took to become an editor, but I want to say that I don't necessarily think it's the typical path that anyone could follow. To this day, I believe wholeheartedly that I got really lucky over and over again, and that is what led to this being a reality. In fact, I don't really even know what the typical path is to doing what I do, but if describing my journey can help some other people out, if even just a little bit, then I'm all for it. Before I start though, this whole story covers nearly a decade, so I'm gonna shorten it up a bit to keep it as relevant and interesting as possible. So, the best place that I can think for this story to start is actually high school. It was around that time that I got it pretty firmly in my mind that I wanted to be a screenwriter. I absolutely loved movies and television, as I obviously still do, and my dream at that time was to do that for a living. So fast forward to about senior year of high school, and I have to start seriously considering colleges. Now, of course, any college that I went to, I wanted to major in screenwriting. Even though I was thrilled with that option, my parents weren't, mainly my dad. Together we did a bit of research, and me and my dad found out how incredibly difficult it is actually making it in Hollywood, especially for screenwriters. Now, don't get me wrong, both my parents were super supportive and were going to back me in whatever I wanted to do, so it wasn't like I was being pressured or anything. But they were also trying to get me to consider the best situation for my career and all the student loan debt that I would be getting. As a side note, both of my parents are engineers and are pretty much math geniuses, so when I told them I wanted to write for a living, their eyes kind of rolled back in their head. Ultimately, my dad did convince me to choose a major with a bit more stability and return on investment, or at least that's what he wanted. So instead of screenwriting, what I chose to major on was psychology. And for all of you who don't know, that really isn't that much better at all than screenwriting when you're talking about return on investment. I say that because a bachelor's degree in psychology is basically useless. At minimum, all the decent paying jobs in psych require a master's degree, and that's what I'm getting right now. But realistically, most of them require a PhD, which by definition means I would have to take another 6 years of postgrad on top of my 4 years of undergrad. But anyway, I digress. I cemented myself in a major in psychology and was accepted to and eventually attended Loyola Marymount University. Now, a good portion of the people I run into haven't heard of LMU, but it's a liberal arts school and it takes its liberal arts very seriously. One of the first things that I discovered there was the difference between how the public saw psychology field, i.e. me as a dumb teenager, and how the actual psychology field was like. Everyone thinks of the person in the room with the couch that you lay on and you tell all your problems to. Those are clinicians, the psychotherapists, the counselors, the shrinks. But another massive part of the psych field is research-based. Those are all the people who did the work in putting together the info behind those articles you see on Facebook and Reddit. Those psych researchers employ experimental and non-experimental methods to come to scientific conclusions about individuals, populations, basically anything with the brain. If it has a brain, they're probably studying it. This research side of psychology is what my college, Loyola Marymount, emphasized in its curriculum, and research in the psych world is centered around written, published articles, so that's what they prepared us for as psych students. And if any one of you out there has actually read a psychology article, the writing isn't meant to be flowery or entertaining. Psych articles are meant to be concise, efficient, formulaic explanations of complex information, written in such a way that anyone could understand them. That approach became the basis of how I saw writing in college. My entire mental picture on how to express my opinions in written form was based around concision, clarity, and cohesion. For my first 2 years in college, all the papers that I wrote, and one was 80 pages, were written, edited, and graded with this strict perspective. Now, let's skip to the summer before my junior year, because that is where my life took a huge left turn. I was on break from classes and therefore had nothing to do with my day but piss it away with video games and anime. Taking a small break from both of those things, I found some writing challenge that I was interested in online. All it said to do was basically draw random shapes on a piece of paper and then turn that shape into a map for a fictional continent. Then after that, create some history and lore for flavor. I thought, okay, cool, why not? I didn't have anything else to do anyway. Well, I made my map, and over the next week, I created my lore and my history. The problem was that it was 30,000 words of lore and history, which is roughly about 100 pages. So yes, things had gotten absolutely out of hand. I had made like 3,000 years of history with like a dozen cultures and wars and powers, really the whole fantasy shebang. So as I looked at these pages and pages of world building, basically, I promised myself that I wouldn't let it all go to waste. And it was in that moment that I decided to write a book based on this map. Also, I feel like an additional piece of context is needed here. Up until that point in college, I hated reading books. And on some level, even now, I still kinda do. Okay, I think hate is a bit of a strong word. I never found myself entertained by books and reading. No matter how popular the series was and no matter how acclaimed the work, for some reason, I always seemed to lose interest. At that time, I could count the books on my hand that I actually enjoyed. And I think this was a huge reason I wanted to write my own book. I was kind of jealous of everybody else. There was this entire medium of entertainment that just didn't seem catered to me. So I decided that if someone wasn't going to write a book that I like, I would write that book myself. And for all of you other psych majors out there, yes, this totally was my suppressed desire to be a screenwriter, simply manifesting in a different way. So fast forward a few months and I have about 60,000 words written of my first book, and it's not even close to being done. And let me tell you, it was garbage. I mean, this thing was horrendous. I kid you not, the first chapter didn't even have spacings between the paragraphs. But that's what happens when a person who doesn't read books tries to write a book. Even though I was really happy with the manuscript, I at least had the clarity of mind to realize I needed help. Luckily for me, registration for classes was right around the corner. What I did was enroll in a creative writing class because I thought, hey, I'm paying all this money to go to a liberal arts college, I might as well make the use of it. So I was all excited about learning how to become a better writer, and I thought I should look up the professor who was going to be teaching me. To my actual complete shock, it was a black guy, Michael Datcher, a best-selling author who had been featured on Oprah. Now, if you haven't been to Loyola Marymount University, I will let you in on a little secret. There aren't a lot of black people. Just to put it in perspective, I think I was one of 2 black guys in the entire psych department. So when I saw my professor was a black author, it was like finding a dark little oasis in a desert. So what I do is I email the professor and tell him my situation. Hey, I'm a beginning writer on my first book taking your class, and I would love some feedback if you ever had the time. A little while later, Professor Datcher told me to email him what I had and he would actually get to it. Honest to God, that was enough for me and I was very satisfied. So my junior year starts and I'm 3 or 4 weeks in, and I had a few good creative writing class sessions, and Professor Datcher pulls me aside after class. He tells me he actually liked what I sent him and what he saw from me in class, which of course caused a huge dopey smile on my face. But then he tells me before he reads any more of my work, he wants me to read through Story by Robert McKee, that book I mention all the time on the main channel. He tells me to finish that book, then go back over my own book, and then he would look at the edited version of my manuscript again. I thought that was only fair because Lord knows he shouldn't be forced to read any more of my crap in its current state. So I went back to my dorm, I bought Story by Robert McKee, read it, and it changed my whole life. It was the first time that I can remember that I ever had the complex parts of writing broken down in objective terms. I'd always thought of creative writing as this super nuanced, esoteric, and possibly subjective art form, and yes, in a way it is. But I learned from Robert McKee that writing is also incredibly formulaic, systemic, and objectively knowable. And in a sense, I felt a sort of validation, because the more I read, the more I realized I wasn't the problem with not liking books. Or at least I wasn't all of the problem. Sure, I did have a high standard for what a book needed to be to entertain me, but a large part of the reason was that most books I was reading were just poorly written. And then it all clicked, and I think what I'm about to say applies to millions of other people. My preferred form of entertainment is visual. I like sports, I like television, I like movies, I like manga. My brain is just wired to respond more attentively to visual stimuli. But that doesn't mean I can't like written entertainment. What it means is that I have a high threshold for what can entertain me in the written form, and if something doesn't reach that threshold, I'm not going to enjoy it. And because Story by Robert McKee, I started seeing all the ways that the written narratives could be better to reach my threshold. And from there, the floodgates were open. Let me tell you, I was reading about writing probably every waking moment of free time I had. Learning about narratives and editing became personal to me because every time I learned about a new technique or story formation, it was like learning why I didn't get books for so many years. Not to mention, it just helped me make my book better, which made me feel good. So weeks go by, I'm turning in pieces for Professor Datcher's class, I tell him I finished Story by Robert McKee, and then he pulls me aside again one day. He basically tells me that every year he handpicks students to work on a book with him, and he wanted to bring me on as an editor. He had been reading my assignments in class and apparently thought I improved enough to the point where I could work with him. And from that point on, I was editing all the time. I got to be mentored by a best-selling author. I took more creative writing classes with more accomplished, published writers. I edited for people online and studied how other editors approached their craft. And I continued writing myself, learning more and more about different genres, POV styles, character arcs, and narrative archetypes. From there, it just became a matter of getting more exposure and clients, which luckily YouTube allowed me to do. And for you guys wondering, I have thought long and hard about where my improvements as an editor came from to be recognized by my professor, and I've settled on 4 distinct things, and I think they're all kind of intertwined. First, I think my curse of not liking reading turned into a blessing, because my baseline for going into a written work was to already be super critical. Because my threshold for enjoying written material was so high, I was super sensitive to any mistake being made in a manuscript. If the pacing is too slow, I'm going to notice it. If the dialogue is off, I'm going to notice it. If there's anything in a manuscript that would bother a reader, I'm most likely going to pick up on it because I don't generally enjoy reading. Basically, if you can win me over to like your written work, that means other people like me who don't like to read will like your written work. And those are the people that writers really should be worried about. Second, it wasn't just that I had a high threshold for reading, it was that I knew the mistakes to look for. Because of Story by Robert McKee and all the other material I inundated myself with, I understood when there was a lack of conflict in a narrative, or when the protagonist didn't have agency. Editing became a ones and zeros game to me. Is this included or is this not? And it helped me to recognize not only that I didn't like something, it helped me to recognize why I didn't like something, why that piece of writing didn't work. The third reason was that I had made all the mistakes a writer could ever make while writing my own bad book. I had practical knowledge of what writing was like, so I didn't have to rely on theory or guessing. I knew how to edit other people's work because any problem I saw in their writing, I had probably already done it in my own horrible manuscript, probably 100 times worse too. Again, I cannot understate this, I was a garbage writer, and I apologize to all the people I subjected my trash to. But making those mistakes myself and fixing them in my own book allowed me to know the advice I was giving as an editor worked, because I saw it myself. Lastly, and probably most underrated, I credit my background in psychology writing. For years, I was taught to say the most meaning with the fewest words by actual scientists and researchers. I learned the fundamentals and the complexities of concision and clarity, and I was able to transfer that over into how to make a fictional narrative just as tight and efficient. Like I said, my path to being where I am now is filled with a ton of luck. I don't think it's necessarily repeatable, but that path was also filled with a ton of hard work. And that is something that I think can be repeated pretty much by anybody. Again, I skipped over a ton of little minute details and information, but all of what you just heard is the gist of what formed the foundation for me doing this. If you guys have any more questions or curiosities, please feel free to ask in the comments. Make sure you subscribe too so you can be notified whenever I upload again. And if you're feeling super generous, you can support me on Patreon. I'll put a link in the description. Anyway, thank you guys for watching me ramble all the way to the end. As always, it was a pleasure, and I will talk to you all again soon.